The neighbor walked past the 3 cabins on the north edge of the settlement and stopped. No smoke from any of them. It was midwinter, temperature holding somewhere below 0, the brutal cold that made exposed skin hurt within minutes. The 3 cabins that faced the pine forest stood silent and smokeless, while every other structure in the settlement was pouring smoke up into the bitter air. He was convinced they were frozen inside, families huddled under every blanket they owned, desperate, dying. He walked faster and banged on the first door hard, sure he'd find tragedy. It opened. Ferris Oakley stood there, shirt sleeves rolled up, grinning that gap-toothed grin of his. Inside, the cabin was warm. Actually warm. Not the desperate heat of a dying fire, but genuine, steady warmth that made the visitor's face flush as cold air rushed out. "Morning," Ferris said. Come in. No sense letting that heat escape." The neighbor stepped in and immediately checked the stove. It was cold. No fire, no coals, nothing. He looked at Ferris. "How long since you fired that?" the neighbor asked. "Since yesterday morning," Ferris said. "Come on, let me show you something." They walked to the second cabin. Same thing. Warm inside, cold stove. The neighbor was beginning to think Ferris had gone mad or was running some kind of trick. The third cabin was identical. A young widow named Mercy Trask opened the door, and the neighbor could see her children playing on the floor in shirt sleeves, actually warm. The mother herself, sitting on a simple chair with no visible source of heat anywhere. "How?" the neighbor asked. Ferris grinned wider. "Come on, I'll show you." They went outside. At the back of each cabin, where the foundation met the earth, Ferris showed him something that looked like nothing. A gap in the ground, carefully lined with stone. A wooden damper valve set into it. Beyond that, the neighbor could trace a line of low, stone-topped trenches running away from each cabin, converging like a road toward a single structure that stood alone in the settlement's center, the communal bread oven. That beehive-shaped masonry thing the settlement had built years ago for shared bread baking. The neighbor understood about half of it, and none of it at the same time. "Come over here," Ferris said. "You can feel it." They walked to the oven. Ferris opened the iron door. Inside, flames burned, steady and even. The oven had been fired early this morning for today's bread baking. It would burn all day. Ferris pointed to where the flue exited the oven, then pointed to where it dove underground, channeling into one of the stone-lined trenches. "That's heat," Ferris said. "In a normal oven, all that heat goes straight up the chimney. Gone, wasted. But what if it didn't? What if it traveled through those trenches first? What if it warmed the ground under those cabins before it left?" The neighbor felt the side of the trench with his hand. It was warm. "All day long," Ferris said, "the oven burns for bread. Bread has to bake hot and slow. The heat's going to escape. So instead of letting it vanish, we catch it. Route it underground, let it heat the cabins. Then it leaves through that chimney at the far end. 3 families stay warm. The oven gets its job done anyway. The heat that would have been wasted now keeps 3 homes above freezing without burning their own firewood." The neighbor tried to think of this. It was so simple and so strange and so logical that it hurt. This was how Ferris Oakley had arrived at the settlement 3 years ago. He came from Street, Louis, where he'd worked as a bricklayer for wages and had grown tired of it. He wanted land and sky and something he could build that would last. He brought his wife, Rosa, who kept the household books and thought in systems and understood how things could work together instead of separate. The settlement was small then, maybe 40 people. It had a communal oven because that was more efficient than everyone trying to bake in their own fireplace or stove. But efficiency was something nobody in the frontier settlement particularly cared about. People cared about survival. They cared about their own plot and their own family, and being left alone. Ferris was different. He talked. He explained things while he worked. He made jokes that weren't funny. He gestured when he spoke, using his hands to draw pictures in the air. He was exhausting to be around, and somehow also appealing. People liked him, despite themselves. Rosa was sharp enough to cut glass and said almost nothing, which meant when she did speak, people listened. That winter, 3 years ago, Ferris had been examining the bread oven one afternoon. He'd knelt at its base and was running his hands over the masonry, studying how it was constructed, how the flue was shaped. Rosa was there, and she was watching him examine it the way she watched everything, with her arms crossed and her mind clearly 3 steps ahead. "You're going to build something," Rosa said. "I'm looking," Ferris said. "You're going to build something with that oven, and you're going to spend months on it, and half the settlement's going to think you're crazy." Ferris grinned at her. "You know me too well." "I know you exactly enough," Rosa said. "So what is it?" Ferris stood and used a stick to sketch lines in the dirt. He drew the oven. He drew 3 cabins beside it. He drew lines connecting them, lines that went underground. Heat, he said. That oven burns hot every single day. Bread gets baked. Heat goes up the chimney and gets lost. What if it didn't? What if we dug channels, stone-lined, under the ground between the oven and those 3 cabins, the closest ones? The flue could run through those channels before it exits. The heat stays in the stone. The stone radiates it into the cabins. 3 families don't burn their own firewood. Rosa looked at the sketch for a long time. "You're throwing heat away," she said. "Every day, literally up the chimney." "Yes," Ferris said. "And you want to catch it." "Yes." "Have you read about this somewhere?" she asked. "The Romans did it," Ferris said. 2,000 years ago. I found it in a book in the St. Louis Library before we left. They called it a hippocaust. They had fires in one place and heated entire bath complexes with flues running under the floors. I've been thinking about it since." Rosa nodded slowly. "It would work," she said. "But you'd have to dig. A lot. And you'd have to stone it correctly. No cracks or the heat leaks the wrong way. And you'd have to get other people to help and to trust it and to keep it running." "I know," Ferris said. "So you really will do it," Rosa said. That spring, Ferris started talking to people. His enthusiasm was hard to ignore. He explained the Roman system. He sketched channels in the dirt at the settlement center, and people gathered to listen, skeptical but curious. The 3 cabins closest to the oven were occupied by Mercy Trask, the young widow with 2 small children and almost no resources, and Eamon Boyle, the Irish immigrant who'd come to the frontier after working with stone his entire life, and the family of one of the settlement's original founders. Mercy was desperate. Firewood that winter had cost her nearly everything. She had an old broken stove and a fireplace that drew poorly, and she couldn't afford to heat the cabin decently. Her children had slept in coats. When Ferris explained the oven system to her, she didn't hesitate. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll help dig." Eamon listened to Ferris's explanation and immediately began thinking about the technical problems. How wide should the channels be? How much slope? What about water and moisture? What kind of stone? Could you control heat flow to each cabin separately? His experience in County Clare had taught him everything about stone, its weaknesses, how to set it, how water destroyed bad mortar, how thermal stress could crack bad work. "The flue," Eamon said to Ferris. "You'll need damper valves. Simple things, just panels that slide to control how much heat flows to each cabin. If one family doesn't want heat, they close their damper, but that affects the draft for the others. You'll need to make them adjustable." Ferris nodded. "Come on," he said to Eamon. "You think about this. Tell me what you see." They stood together, walking the proposed path of the channels. Eamon thought out loud. The gravel bed under the channels for drainage so water doesn't accumulate. The channel slope so flue gases move consistently. The thickness of the stone lining so the heat radiates properly, but the structure doesn't collapse. "We need to get this right," Eamon said. "This isn't a wall you build once and leave. This is something that'll run hot every single day. Bad stone, bad mortar, and you'll have cracks. Cracks means smoke in the cabins. Smoke in a home in winter is a sickness." But there was opposition. Dunlap, the old farmer who'd been in the settlement longer than anyone, watched Ferris sketching and explaining and felt something rise in his chest. Resistance, the kind that runs on principle. Dunlap had lived through 3 recessions, 2 Indian raids, 1 plague of locusts, and he'd survived all of it by depending on nobody but himself. The frontier had taught him that. The frontier had proven it. "Every man heats his own cabin," Dunlap said to anyone who'd listen. "That's how it works. You heat your own fire, your own wood, your own responsibility. This shared business, it's not right. It makes you dependent. Makes you weak." The other settlers heard him. Some nodded. Some didn't say anything, but their silence was agreement. The frontier was built on the assumption that you could trust yourself and nobody else, that independence was survival, that asking for help was admitting failure. Ferris overheard Dunlap's words one afternoon and walked over to where the old farmer stood, watching the construction work. "Dunlap," Ferris said, not aggressive, just persistent. "Come look at this for a minute." "I'm looking," Dunlap said. "Come here," Ferris said. "I want you to understand the logic of this." Ferris walked him through it slowly, not arguing, but explaining. "The oven's already burning," he said. 7 days a week it burns. Bread has to bake hot and slow. That heat has to go somewhere. Right now it goes straight up the chimney. Wasted. We don't change the oven. We change where the heat travels before it leaves. We guide it through channels beneath 3 cabins. It warms the stone. The stone radiates warmth. Then the heat leaves through the final chimney. The cabins stay warmer. Less firewood burned. Same result for the oven, same bread gets baked, different result for the people. "It's not the principle of it," Dunlap said. "What principle?" Ferris asked. "The principle of wasting heat? The principle of watching people freeze to death when there's heat available? The principle of depending on others," Dunlap said flatly. "I heat my own cabin. I cut my own wood. If I don't cut enough, I freeze. That teaches you to plan. That teaches you to work hard. That's how you stay sharp. That's how you stay alive. Depending on other people, on their work, their maintenance, their system, that's weakness." "People freeze in this territory every winter," Ferris said. He wasn't angry. He was just stating fact. Not because they're not sharp. Not because they don't work hard enough. Because the cold's just that cold, and firewood's just that expensive, and the winds are just that brutal. We could change that. We could use what we've got, the oven, the heat it makes anyway, and share it. We could make survival less about suffering and more about cooperation. It doesn't make anyone weak. It makes everyone warmer. Dunlap looked at the construction. He looked at Mercy, the young widow working alongside the men, digging because she'd said yes immediately. He looked at Eamon, whose expertise was making the system better. He looked at Ferris, whose enthusiasm never wavered even when faced with resistance. "I'll think about it," Dunlap said finally, and he walked away, arms crossed, mind working but not yet willing to change. By early summer, Ferris and Eamon and a rotating crew of settlers began digging. The work was harder than anyone had imagined. The ground was dense and rocky, resistant and stubborn. Every foot of trench had to be precise. The right slope for water drainage, the right depth to reach beneath each cabin, the right width for the flue system, Mercy came to help dig, despite being exhausted from mending clothes and caring for her two small children. The widow worked beside the men, moving earth, learning the system from the foundation up. Her children played near the excavation, safe, watched by settlement women. "You're going to hurt yourself," Ferris said to Mercy one afternoon, watching her lift a heavy load of earth. "I'm going to be warm this winter," she said, without stopping her work. "My children will be warm. That matters more than comfort." The vision of a widow doing the heavy digging work shook the settlement. Some people saw weakness. Others saw necessity. Mercy saw survival. The stonework began in late summer, when the ground had dried enough to work. Eamon led this phase, and his expertise became invaluable. He and Ferris selected flat stones from the riverbed and from an outcrop 2 miles away. The stone had to be reasonably flat, of reasonable thickness, and most importantly, resistant to the thermal stress of flue gases running through it daily. They laid the channels like a careful mosaic, setting each stone in clay mortar, tamping it firm, checking the level constantly. The craftsmanship was beautiful, the sort of work that made other builders stop to watch and understand. Eamon explained as he worked, his Irish accent carrying through the settlement. The mortar had to be clay and stone dust mixed precise, not true lime mortar. Lime was too rigid. When stone got hot from the flue, it expanded. Lime couldn't move with that expansion, it cracked. Clay moved. Stone dust gave it body. Together they accommodated the thermal stress. "This is the part that matters," Eamon said, more than once, kneeling in the trench, setting a stone with precision that looked almost meditative. "Get this wrong and the whole system fails. Get this right, and it'll work for 50 years. Ferris talked the whole time they worked. He explained to anyone watching what they were doing and why. He made bad jokes about bricklayers and mortar consistency. He told stories about the old masonry shops in St. Louis where he'd learned his trade. Stories about apprentices who'd tried to rush their work and had to rebuild entire walls as punishment. He asked questions and asked more questions, genuinely curious about Eamon's expertise, wanting to understand every principle. His hands moved quickly, placing stones, tamping mortar, checking angles and slopes and levels. He worked alongside Eamon and Mercy and the other settlers, not as the boss, but as one person among many, all working toward the same goal. By mid-autumn, the channels were complete and stone-lined perfectly. The damper valve system was built. Simple wooden frames with sliding panels set into the channels just under each cabin's foundation, allowing each family to control how much heat flowed through their section. Eamon's idea, executed with precision. It meant no family was dependent on the oven being maintained a certain way. Each family had control over their own warmth. The flue connection was the final piece, where the oven's exit flue would channel into the first trench and then travel underground, passing through all 3 channels before exiting through a final chimney at the far end. Ferris and Eamon did this work together, careful and concentrated. This was where any mistake would be catastrophic, any leak, any improper connection, and the system wouldn't draft properly. The oven might back up with smoke, or worse, heat would go where it shouldn't. But they got it right. The connection was perfect. The first fire came on a cold October morning. The settlement was anxious in a way that felt almost dangerous. This was either going to work or it was going to fail publicly, catastrophically, in front of everyone. Years later, Ferris would remember the weight of that moment, all the work, all the explanation, all the persuasion. It came down to whether heat would flow underground and rise up through floorboards. Ferris and Eamon and Rosa and Mercy and the families from the other 2 cabins gathered as Ferris prepared the oven for bread. His hands were steady. But his energy was different this time, quieter, more focused. This wasn't the enthusiastic bricklayer explaining a theory. This was the man staking his reputation on his system. He loaded kindling carefully and began the fire. It caught and grew. The flames built. The temperature inside the oven climbed steadily. After an hour, the oven was hot enough for baking. Ferris slid bread into the dark heat, long loaves that would bake slow and perfect. "Now we wait," he said, "and we see if physics works the way it's supposed to." Everyone was silent. Nervous silence. Minutes passed. The oven burned. The bread baked in the heat. But did anything else happen? Then Mercy walked over to where a gap in the trench allowed them to see inside, a small observation point Eamon had built into the design specifically for this moment. She knelt and placed her hand on the stone channel. "It's warm," she said, wonder in her voice, hope. Within a few more minutes, the stone was noticeably warm. Heat was traveling. The first cabin's occupant checked their floor. Warm. The second cabin the same. The third cabin reported the same warmth flowing up through their boards. For hours, the oven burned. Bread baked perfectly in the steady heat. And underneath, heat traveled through stone channels, warming earth, warming cabins, warming families. The experiment was working. The theory was becoming reality. But there was a problem. By the time the flue gases had traveled through all 3 channels and exited the final chimney, their volume had diminished slightly. Not catastrophically, but enough to affect draft. The final chimney wasn't drawing as hard as it should. Smoke was beginning to back up instead of traveling through. The system worked thermally, but the engineering of airflow was failing. Ferris noticed it first. The smoke wasn't moving right. It hung in the channels instead of flowing. He called Eamon over, and together they traced the problem. "The channel's too narrow," Eamon said after studying the flue carefully. "We squeezed it when we should have expanded it. The gases need more room to move. We need to widen the first section, where the draft is strongest. Give the gases a larger space and they'll move faster. Create better vacuum. Pull the hot air through." Ferris nodded. He understood. But it meant work. It meant digging up the first channel section and resetting all the stones wider. It meant breaking what they'd built to fix it. "We have to do it," Eamon said simply. "A system that doesn't draft properly isn't safe. It's dangerous even." They dug it up. Ferris worked one side, Eamon the other. Rosa helped remove the old stones. Mercy helped place the new, wider stones. A week later, the system was retested. Bread went into the oven. The channels warmed. The draft pulled perfectly. The heat moved. The system worked. Ferris, covered in dust and mortar, looked at Eamon. "Thank you," Ferris said. "For what?" Eamon asked. "For fixing my mistake," Ferris said. "For knowing what was wrong. For not letting me live with a broken system." Eamon smiled. "That's what collaboration is," he said. "You see what I miss? I see what you miss. Together, we get it right." Winter came early. October frosts turned to November snow, turned to December blizzards. The 3 families opened their damper valves carefully, learning how much heat they each needed, experimenting with settings. Ferris and Rosa and Mercy and Eamon and the others created a schedule. Who would fire the oven each day? Who would monitor the draft? Who would clean the ash? The work was constant and precise. If the oven wasn't fired, no heat flowed. If the channels weren't cleaned, ash choked the system. If the dampers weren't maintained, heat distribution failed. It required cooperation, attention, commitment. One afternoon in early December, Mercy's neighbor came by to check on her. The neighbor was worried. She hadn't seen smoke coming from Mercy's cabin in days. "How much firewood have you used?" the neighbor asked, expecting to find the widow and her children in desperate cold. Mercy pointed to her small woodpile. barely touched. Almost none, she said. A little for the cooking stove, some kindling for quick heat if the oven isn't fired for some reason. But my cabin is warm. The floor is warm. The children sleep without coats. They play without being cold. The neighbor felt the cabin warmth. Actually warm. Not the desperate warmth of a dying fire, but steady, sustained warmth. She was astonished. The word spread through the settlement. 3 cabins, barely burning any wood, staying warm all winter. How was it possible? The answer was collaboration, shared heat, community work. Things the frontier had been trying to kill. By mid-December, the system was operating perfectly, but maintenance began to complicate things. Ash buildup in the channels started to choke the airflow. It had to be cleaned monthly, a filthy, difficult job that meant crawling into the stone trenches with brushes and careful technique, removing the dust and ash without damaging the mortar. "This part's not fun," Ferris said to Rosa one afternoon, covered in gray dust. "I didn't think it would be," Rosa said. But then, in late January, a real problem emerged. A crack formed in the mortar of one of the channel sections under Eamon's cabin. It was small, barely visible, but it was enough. Smoke began seeping through it into the cabin above. Eamon noticed it when his home began to smell wrong, that acrid smoke smell that didn't belong. He came to Ferris. "Channel's cracked," he said simply. They dug it up together. The crack was under the thermal stress that Eamon had warned about. The clay mortar had moved, but not quite enough. They scraped out the cracked section and reset it with fresh mortar, carefully tamped and sealed. "We'll need to inspect it every spring," Eamon said. "After the freeze cycles, thermal stress will keep trying to break this." "I know," Ferris said. "I'm sorry about this." "You're not sorry," Eamon said. "You did the work right. Winter's trying to break it. That's different." The real test came in late February. The settlement experienced the worst cold snap anyone could remember. For 6 days straight, the temperature didn't get above -10. The wind was brutal. Firewood consumption in the other cabins was desperate and unsustainable. People cut through their winter stores at a rate that meant they'd run out before spring. But the 3 cabins connected to the oven system stayed warm. The oven fired every day. The heat traveled. The families were comfortable. On the 4th day of the cold snap, Dunlap's wife appeared at Rosa's cabin. She looked desperate. "How much heat do you have?" she asked. "All we need," Rosa said. "The floor's warm. We have blankets." "We're running out of wood," Dunlap's wife said. "At this rate, we'll freeze by March." Rosa didn't say "I told you so." She just said, "Talk to Ferris." The next morning, Dunlap appeared at the oven. He didn't say anything. He just stood there and watched the fire burn, watched the heat travel, understood what was happening. He stayed there for an hour. Then he left, without speaking. A week later, when the cold snap had passed and the settlement could breathe again, Dunlap came to find Ferris. Every man in town had an opinion about Dunlap's change of mind. None of them were helpful. Some criticized him for admitting the error. Some mocked him for taking so long to understand. Some questioned whether the system would really work in the long term. But Dunlap didn't care what anyone thought. He cared that his wife had stopped looking desperate, that his children's coughs were improving, that his daughter could play without shivering, that the constant fear of freezing was draining out of the cabin. That was what mattered. They stood together at the oven entrance, watching the flames burn steady. "How far could you extend those channels?" Dunlap asked directly. "Depends on a lot," Ferris said, thinking through it. "Too far and the heat dissipates too much. The stone cools it down as the flue gases travel. Maybe another cabin, maybe 2, if we got the engineering and the slope right. Beyond that, you're just moving cold air, not heat. The system has limits." Dunlap nodded. He'd learned something about limits from this winter. If I wanted to connect a fourth cabin, Dunlap said, what would that look like? How much digging? How much time? Ferris smiled, not gloating, just pleased. Well, he said, we'd have to dig again. Long channels. We'd have to stone it carefully. We'd have to install another damper valve, and you'd have to help maintain it. Help tend the oven some days. You'd have to keep the channels clear of ash. You'd have to work with other people to make it work. You couldn't do it alone. I know all that, Dunlap said. Do you really understand what that means? Ferris pressed. The labor and the cooperation both? That you can't do this alone? I do, Dunlap said. His voice was different now. Older, maybe, or more honest. My wife won't let me freeze, and I'm not proud enough to freeze to death to prove a point about independence. Pride kills in winter. That's what I learned. That spring, as the weather warmed and the worst of the maintenance work was done, Ferris and Eamon and Dunlap and 2 other settlers began planning an expansion. New channels would need to be dug. The engineering would need to be adjusted. 4 families instead of 3 would mean more careful calculations about heat distribution. But first they had to discuss what to do. Every man in town had an opinion about the expansion. None of them were helpful. Some said it was too risky to extend the system. Some said the math didn't work. Some said they should rebuild the oven instead of expanding the channels. But Ferris and Eamon and Dunlap listened to the opinions, considered them, and ignored them. They had real work to do. Dunlap threw himself into the work, learning from Ferris and Eamon, understanding the techniques, not saying much, but absorbing everything. The man who'd said independence was survival, was learning, slowly, that cooperation could be genuine strength, that asking for help wasn't weakness, that working alongside people wasn't dependence, it was resilience. By summer, 4 cabins were connected. Plans for a 5th and 6th were sketched in the dirt at the settlement's center. The shared oven had become something more than a place to bake bread. It became the heart of a system where families didn't freeze alone. It became proof that the frontier could be different, that survival didn't have to mean isolation, that innovation could mean cooperation instead of competition. Ferris and Rosa, in their cabin warmed by the system they'd created, watched the settlement transform. Rosa kept detailed records of everything: temperature measurements, fuel consumption, maintenance schedules. She was building the documentation that would allow others to replicate the system in other places. Her mind, which thought in systems and patterns, was as essential to the innovation as Ferris's hands and enthusiasm. The vindication wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't a moment of triumph. It was simply that when the next winter came, fewer people burned through their firewood. Fewer families had to choose between eating and staying warm. Fewer people were desperate. Fewer people were cold. The settlement had changed its survival strategy from fighting together to thriving together. And in the cabin that had once been so cold that a widow's children slept in coats despite the fire, there was warmth. There was daily life. There was comfort. There was the simple fact of being able to breathe without your breath turning to ice before it left your mouth. Mercy Trask's children grew up in that warmth. They learned to tend the oven. They learned that community was about more than proximity. It was about shared work and shared heat and survival, built on cooperation. Mercy Trask never forgot that cold snap 3 years ago, the one before the oven system worked. She remembered the desperation, thinking her children might not survive winter, knowing there wasn't enough firewood, watching her baby cough constantly from the cold. She remembered the fear that woke her at night, the calculations about whether she could make it to the next settlement, whether the journey would kill her children faster than winter would. She remembered considering whether surrender was better than suffering. She also remembered the morning the floor first went warm, the first time she placed her hand on the wood and felt heat rising from beneath, heat from a fire that wasn't hers, but that warmed her home anyway. Heat that was given to her by her community, by Ferris and Eamon and Rosa and Dunlap and all the others who'd worked to make this possible. She'd cried that morning, not quietly, but openly. Her children confused but hopeful, finally allowed to be children instead of survivors. Sometimes in winter she'd kneel on that warm floor and put her palm down and think about shared things, about how isolation looked like strength until the cold came and proved it was just loneliness, about how people digging trenches together, building channels together, trusting together, could accomplish something one person alone could never do, about how the strongest person isn't the one who refuses help and demands independence. It's the one smart enough to ask for help and brave enough to offer it, knowing that community is built on mutual care and shared work. The bread oven stood in the settlement center, and every day it burned hot. Every day, heat that would have been wasted up a chimney went somewhere useful. It went underground, through stone, beneath the earth, and it rose up through the floorboards of homes where families were warm and alive and grateful. The settlement learned something that the frontier had tried to teach from the beginning, but that it took 3 families staying warm while others froze to finally believe. That sometimes the strongest solution is the one you build together. That sometimes shared warmth is better than the illusion of independence. That sometimes what keeps you alive isn't what you do alone, but what you do alongside someone else, someone who digs when you dig, works when you work, believes what you believe. That heat shouldn't be wasted, that work shouldn't be solitary, and that survival is better when it's shared. The vindication came quietly. Dunlap didn't apologize. He just helped dig the channels for the 4th cabin. He helped select the stones. He helped monitor the draft. He became, without announcing it, part of the system. Mercy's children grew up in that warm home and learned to tend the oven and understand that community was about more than proximity. It was about transforming one family's waste into another family's warmth. Eamon Boyle, the Irish immigrant with knowledge from County Clare, became the master mason of the region. He trained others in stonework. He traveled to neighboring settlements and taught them the principles: how to select stone, how to mix mortar for thermal stress, how to think about systems instead of individual structures. He lived long, saw his great-grandchildren, and never stopped talking about the importance of getting the mortar right, of respecting the stone, of understanding that thermal stress was real and had to be planned for. He'd become unexpectedly a skilled worker and a teacher, a philosopher of craft. And Ferris, the talkative bricklayer from St. Louis with his gap-toothed grin and his constant explaining, finally understood something deeper than engineering. The frontier wasn't about going it alone. It was about being willing to explain, willing to persuade, willing to work alongside people until they understood what you'd understood from the start. That shared solutions could be stronger than solitary ones. That waste heat was just heat waiting to be useful. That bread and warmth and survival could all come from one simple, beautiful, collaboratively built system. He understood that the frontier wasn't a place for isolated heroes working alone. It was a place for communities working together strategically. That the strongest innovations weren't the ones that let you survive independently. They were the ones that let everyone survive together. In spring, when the frost came out of the ground and the mortar cracked and needed repair, the settlement came together to fix it. Every man in town had an opinion. None of them were helpful, but they came anyway because they understood now. They all understood. The oven kept them alive. The heat was theirs to share, and the work was theirs to do together. By the 5th winter, 7 cabins were connected to the shared heat system. By the 10th year, the system had been expanded multiple times, improved, refined, made more efficient. Eamon had trained 3 other skilled masons in stonework. All of them understood the principles. All of them could maintain and repair. Dunlap had become the expert on maintaining the flue sections and the damper valves, taking responsibility for something he'd once rejected. Mercy had become the keeper of the daily oven roster, the person who organized who would fire it each day, who would clean the ash, who would monitor the draft and make sure the system worked. These 4 people, Ferris, Eamon, Dunlap, and Mercy, had become the beating heart of the system that saved them all. And the bread oven, once just a place to bake communal bread, became the heart of something more profound. A reminder that heat rises, light spreads, and warmth shared is the only warmth worth having. That the strongest structures are built by people who know how to work together. That the frontier was never actually about isolation, no matter what the stories said. It was always about being strong enough to trust someone else, and wise enough to understand that survival isn't about going it alone. It's about the people you build with, the people you share heat with, the communities that choose cooperation over competition.